2,520 people died of hypothermia in the United States. In the most recent year, the CDC has fully counted, a number that has climbed roughly 35% since 2014. And the detail almost no one mentions when that statistic gets quoted is that the overwhelming majority of those people were not unequipped. They had coats, many had sleeping bags. Some had been handed Mylar blankets directly out of an outreach worker's hands. The same week they died. Sacramento County alone recorded 34 hypothermia-linked deaths. Between 2021 and 2023, nearly double the count from the 3 years before that, in a place where donation drives run constantly and gear flows into encampments by the truckload every winter. The problem was never the absence of gear. The problem was what the gear was actually doing once the temperature dropped, and almost none of it was doing what the person wearing it believed. This is the part that survival content almost never says out loud, because it complicates the easy fix. The instinct, when someone is cold and underdressed, is to give them more of whatever fabric is closest at hand. Bulk feels like protection. A heavy cotton hoodie under a donated parka feels like more insulation than a thin synthetic layer because it's heavier in the hand and warmer against dry skin in a heated room. But cotton absorbs roughly 25 times its own weight in water. And once it's damp, from sweat, from breath condensing inside a hood, from rain that never even fully soaked through, it stops insulating and starts actively pulling heat out of the body through direct contact, because water conducts heat away from skin far faster than dry air does. A man who had spent 2 winters cycling through Denver's emergency shelters described the exact moment he understood this. "I had 3 sweatshirts on, and I was colder than the night I only had one. Nobody told me the extra 2 were working against me." The Mylar blanket creates a different kind of false security, and it's one almost every donation drive in the country distributes by the thousand. It reflects a percentage of radiant body heat back toward the person wearing it, which sounds like warmth, but it generates nothing. It only redirects heat the body is already producing. And a body running a low-grade hypothermic chill is not producing much to redirect. Worse, it does almost nothing to stop the colder, faster heat loss. That happens through direct contact with cold ground, which means a person can be fully wrapped in reflective material and still be losing the majority of their heat through their back and legs the entire night. Shelter material fails the same way, just slower. A loose tarp pulled over a sleeping bag seems like it should keep moisture out, but in cold air it traps the body's own breath and sweat against the bag instead, soaking it from the inside while the rain stays outside. A woman who had been sleeping in a tent on the outskirts of Phoenix for 9 months put it plainly. Everyone warns you about the rain getting in. Nobody warns you about your own breathing getting in. That same trapped moisture is what's driving the rise in trench foot among people sleeping outside in cities like Halifax and London, Ontario, where outreach nurses now treat it as routinely as frostbite, a wartime injury that has nothing to do with extreme cold and everything to do with feet that never get the chance to dry. None of the standard answers fix any of this. Donating more layers doesn't fix a layering problem. Handing out more Mylar doesn't fix a heat generation problem. A heavier tarp doesn't fix a moisture problem. Sometimes it makes it worse. What actually determines whether a piece of gear helps or quietly works against the person using it is something almost nobody explains, because it has nothing to do with how much gear someone has, and everything to do with whether they understand what that gear is physically capable of doing once the temperature, the moisture, and the hours Start to add up against them. Begin with the ground itself. Since it's the first method, nearly everyone gets backward. The instinct is to focus all available insulation on top of the body. More blankets, another coat thrown over the shoulders, because cold air is the threat anyone can feel. But the body loses heat to a cold surface beneath it far faster than it loses heat to cold air around it, because direct contact transfers heat through conduction, and conduction works roughly 25 times faster than air ever can. A man who had spent a winter sleeping on benches and loading docks around Seattle described learning this the hard way. I kept buying warmer coats. The cold was coming up through my back the whole time, not down from the sky. The principle underneath this is almost embarrassingly simple once it's named. Insulation placed beneath the body does more to prevent heat loss than the same insulation placed on top of it. Yet almost every dollar of donated gear and almost every layer added in a hurry goes upward instead of downward, because that's where the cold is felt, not where the heat is actually escaping. Feet fail for a related but separate reason, and the mechanism is one that outreach nurses in cities like Chicago now treat with the same routine seriousness as frostbite. Wet socks left inside boots for hours don't just feel uncomfortable. They begin to break down the skin itself, a condition called trench foot. That has nothing to do with freezing temperatures, and everything to do with prolonged moisture against skin that never gets the chance to dry. The counterintuitive part is that warmer, more insulated boots can make this worse rather than better, because thicker insulation traps the sweat the foot produces during walking, and that trapped moisture does more damage over 12 hours than a single soaking from rain ever would. A nurse running a weekly foot clinic out of a mobile health unit described the pattern she sees over and over. People who own good boots but only one pair of socks, cycling the same damp pair night after night, because they have nothing dry to switch into. Storage is where the next mistake hides, and it's almost never discussed because it happens hours before the cold sets in, not during it. Throwing a damp pair of socks, a slightly wet jacket, or a sleeping bag that didn't fully dry from the night before into the same bag as everything else doesn't just risk that one item. It transfers moisture into whatever it touches, so that the one dry layer a person was counting on for the coldest part of the night turns out to be quietly damp by the time they reach for it. A woman who had been living out of a single duffel bag in Atlanta for several months put it without dramatics. I learned to keep one bag for wet things and one bag for dry things. Before that, everything I owned eventually felt the same kind of damp. Visibility creates a different category of risk entirely, one that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with what happens to gear once a person isn't watching it. New, clean, obviously valuable equipment, a bright unused sleeping bag, an expensive-looking backpack, reads as a target in shared or unsecured spaces. And gear that gets taken overnight is gear that isn't there on the one night it matters most. The intuitive move is to seek out the best-looking gear available, since better-made equipment should, in theory, perform better. But equipment that draws attention can end up performing worse over time, simply because it doesn't last. And a man who had spent a stretch sleeping near transit stations in Houston explained the adjustment he eventually made. I stopped carrying anything that looked new. Worn and ugly stays with you longer than new and nice. Hands and extremities fail through a mechanism that's easy to underestimate, because losing dexterity doesn't feel dangerous the way losing core warmth does. A single pair of gloves with no backup means that the moment those gloves get wet, from snow, from condensation, from simply being taken off to handle something, There's no dry option left, and cold, clumsy hands struggle to manage zippers, laces, or anything else that matters in the moment the temperature actually drops. A person who spent 2 winters cycling between shelters and the street in Oakland described carrying a second pair specifically for this reason, kept sealed away and never touched except for emergencies. Because by the time hands stop working well enough to function, it's too late to fix the problem with the hands themselves. The layering mistake that undoes much of this work happens earlier than any of it, in the order pieces go on, rather than which pieces are chosen. Insulating layers, fleece, puffy jackets, anything meant to trap warm air, only work if something is protecting them from wind and moisture, and wearing the insulating layer as the outermost piece exposes it directly to both, stripping away the trapped air that was doing the actual work. A man who had spent a winter outside in Minneapolis described watching this happen to his own setup. I had the warmest jacket I owned, and I wore it on the outside. The wind just punched right through it the whole night. What ties every one of these together is sequence, not severity. Ground insulation only matters if the layers above it aren't already compromised by trapped moisture. Dry socks only matter if the bag they're stored in hasn't already turned them damp. A second pair of gloves only matters if it's been kept separate enough to actually stay dry when the first pair fails. None of these methods function in isolation because cold and moisture move through a system, not through a single weak point, which is exactly why fixing one mistake while leaving the other 5 in place rarely changes the outcome on the coldest night. The risks underneath everything already described are physical, not dramatic, and worth naming plainly. Sleeping directly on cold concrete without a barrier beneath the body can lower core temperature faster than most people expect, especially overnight when there's no movement to generate heat. Wet feet left inside boots for extended periods can break down skin badly enough to require real medical care, not just discomfort. A single point of gear failure, one soaked layer, one missing glove, one bag that turned out to be damp rarely causes harm on its own, but cold works by accumulation and small failures stack quietly across a night until the body is managing more than it can recover from. None of this requires extreme weather. Much of it happens in temperatures that don't feel dangerous at first. Recap it from the ground up. The cold rising through a sleeping surface does more damage than the cold pressing down from the air, which means insulation belongs underneath the body, not just on top of it. Feet fail through trapped moisture more than through cold itself. So dry socks matter as much as warm boots. Storing wet and dry gear together quietly ruins the dry layers a person is counting on, which is why separating them matters before the temperature ever drops. Gear that looks valuable draws attention it can't survive. So worn and unremarkable often outlasts new and impressive. A second pair of gloves, kept dry and untouched until needed, prevents the moment when cold hands can no longer manage the simple tasks that matter most. And insulation only works as the inner layer, protected from wind and moisture by something built to take the weather first. What all of this really describes isn't a checklist. It's knowledge built the only way knowledge like this ever gets built, through cold nights, ruined gear, and the slow correction of assumptions that felt reasonable until they failed. Nobody hands this information out in a kit. It gets carried person to person, city to city, by people who learned it the hard way and decided someone else shouldn't have to. That's the part worth sitting with longer than the methods themselves. Every principle here exists because someone survived long enough to notice what almost didn't work.